Imagine a land that exists in two places at once, pressed between the iron shoulder of Russia and the ancient breath of the Middle East, cradled by the Caucasus Mountains, the great stone spine of the world. A civilization that was writing its own alphabet while much of Europe still carved runes into wood. A people who adopted Christianity before Rome herself had fully surrendered to the cross, and who still holds sacred rites so old that no scholar can fully trace their origins. How does a country stand at the crossroads of empires, Persian, Roman, Arab, Mongol, Ottoman, Soviet, for 3,000 years, and not simply vanish? That is the question. And to answer it, we must climb. Our journey begins not in a capital, not in a palace, not in a library, but in stone. High in the folds of the Greater Caucasus, where the peaks claw at the clouds and the air is so thin and holy it feels borrowed from another world, there are villages that have survived everything history could throw at them. These are not ruins. These are not museums. These are living, breathing communities that have watched empires rise and crash like tides against their mountains and remained. This is Georgia, Sakartvelo in its own tongue, a word that needs no translation once you have seen its landscapes and looked into the eyes of its people. The answer to Georgia's survival lies not in armies or treaties, but in the soul of the mountains themselves. To understand the country between two worlds, we must begin where all great stories begin, at the very edge of the known world. Before there was a Georgia, there was the Caucasus. Think of it not as a mountain range, but as a wall, the largest natural barrier between Europe and Asia, a fortress built by the earth itself. This wall, stretching nearly 1,200 kilometers from the Black Sea to the Caspian, is not merely geography, it is biography. It is the reason Georgia exists at all. In the ancient world, the Greeks called this land Colchis, and they whispered about it with a mixture of terror and fascination. It was here, in their mythology, that Jason and his Argonauts sailed to the very edge of the civilized world in pursuit of the Golden Fleece, that legendary symbol of divine kingship and unimaginable wealth. And what made this myth so potent was that it was not entirely fantasy. The rivers that tumbled down the Caucasus slopes carried, and still carry, real gold dust in their currents. Shepherds in antiquity would stretch sheepskins across the riverbed to catch these particles of gold, and the fleece would gleam. The myth was the memory of a truth too dazzling to be spoken plainly. The earliest human inhabitants of what is now Georgia arrived perhaps 1.8 million years ago. The oldest known hominid remains outside Africa were found at Manisi in the rolling hills of eastern Georgia, in bones that rewrote the human story entirely. This land was not merely at the crossroads of civilization, it was, in a very real sense, one of the birthplaces of humanity's long walk across the world. The stones here do not simply remember Georgia's history, they remember ours. Every great civilization carries within it a defining act, a moment when a people look at the world and declare, "We are here, we are distinct, and we will not be forgotten." For the Georgians, that act was the creation of their alphabet. The Georgian script, Mkhedruli, is one of only 14 independent alphabets ever created in the history of human writing. It was not borrowed, it was not adapted, it was invented, most likely in the 5th century AD, and it is unlike anything else on Earth. Its letters curve like the branches of mountain vines, elegant and deliberate, each character flowing into the next as though the language itself refused to be contained by right angles or hard stops. To see Georgian written on a wall is to know immediately that you are somewhere singular, somewhere that thought its own thoughts and wrote them down in its own way. The creation of this alphabet was inseparable from a spiritual transformation. In 337 AD, or thereabouts, the exact date still debated by scholars, the Kingdom of Kartli, the ancient Georgian heartland, became one of the first nations on earth to formally adopt Christianity as its state religion. The legend says it was through the miraculous intervention of a slave woman, a Christian missionary named Nino, who arrived from Cappadocia carrying a cross bound with her own hair. King Mirian III, the story goes, was hunting in the forests when darkness fell across the land at midday, and in his terror he called upon the god of Nino, and the light returned. A king converted, a nation followed. The alphabet, then, was not merely a writing system, it was an act of theological identity, created to translate scripture, to preserve liturgy, to anchor the Georgian soul to God in a language that belonged entirely to itself. A people who write their prayers in their own script do not easily surrender who they are. Let us now leave the lowland kingdoms and the great dynastic tales and climb, because to understand Georgia, truly understand it, you must go to the places where the roads end and the footpaths begin. You must go to Svaneti. High in the northwestern Caucasus, at altitudes that make the lungs ache and the mind go quiet, lies one of the most extraordinary human landscapes on Earth. Svaneti is a region of glaciers and ancient forests, of rivers so cold they seem liquid glass, of peaks so vertical they appear to lean over the valley floor like curious giants. And scattered across this impossible terrain are the Svan Towers, medieval defensive structures that erupt from the village rooftops like stone fingers pointed at the sky. There are more than 175 of them still standing, some dating back to the 9th century. They were built not for aesthetics, but for survival. When raiders came, and they always came, entire families would retreat into these towers, hauling up ladders, pulling children through narrow doorways, and waiting in the darkness while the storm passed below. The villages of Upper Svaneti, Ushguli, Mestia, Adishi, are among the highest continuously inhabited settlements in Europe, some sitting above 2,100 meters. Ushguli, with its cluster of medieval towers reflected in the mirror of the Anguri River, has been recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. But what no UNESCO designation can fully capture is the feeling of standing in that village as the sun sets behind the peak of Mount Shkara, Georgia's highest summit at nearly 5,200 meters, and watching the towers turn from gray to gold to rust as darkness rises from the valley floor. This is a village that has been inhabited without significant interruption for over 1,000 years. The children playing in its muddy lanes are the latest chapter in a story that was ancient when the Crusades were new. But Svaneti is not Georgia's only mountain world. Travel east through the dramatic gorge of the Argovy River and you enter the region of Kazbegi, Stepanzminda in its modern name, where the land becomes something close to theatrical. Here, the Gergeti Trinity Church, a 14th century Georgian Orthodox cathedral, sits on a promontory above the Terek River at 2,170 meters, with the vast white shoulder of Mount Kazbek, sacred Mkinsvarsveri, the glacier throne of the fire god Prometheus in Georgian legend, rising behind it. To see this church on a clear morning, its cross catching the first light while clouds fill the valley below, is to understand why the Georgians built their holiest places at the very edge of the possible. They wanted their prayers to be heard from the highest place on earth. To speak only of villages and mountains is to speak of the body of Georgia without its soul, because this mountain country, this slender nation, once commanded the most brilliant kingdom in the entire medieval Christian world. Our journey takes us now to the 11th and 12th centuries, the Georgian Golden Age, and to its architect, King David IV, known as David the Builder, David Agmashenebeli in Georgian. He ascended the throne in 1089 as a boy of 16,
inheriting a kingdom fractured by Seljuk Turk invasions that had reduced much of the Caucasus to ruin. What he built over the next 3.5 decades was nothing less than astonishing. Through a combination of military genius, diplomatic cunning, and deep personal piety, David unified the Georgian kingdoms, drove the Seljuks from the Caucasus, and transformed his realm into the dominant power of the entire region. His most spectacular achievement was the Battle of Didgori in 1121, a confrontation so lopsided in the enemy's favor that it should have been a slaughter. A vast coalition of Muslim forces, estimates range from several 100,000 to over 500,000 soldiers, gathered to crush the Georgian army, which numbered perhaps 40,000. David chose a narrow mountain pass, used the terrain with terrifying precision, and won a victory so complete that medieval sources called it simply the miraculous victory. The city of Tbilisi, which had been under Arab control for 4 centuries, fell within months. The Golden Age had begun. But it was David's granddaughter who would define it. Queen Tamar the Great, the only woman ever to reign alone as monarch of Georgia, ascended the throne in 1184, and under her rule Georgia reached its absolute zenith. Her kingdom stretched from the Black Sea coast to the Caspian, encompassing modern Armenia, Azerbaijan, and large parts of Turkey and Iran. Her court at Tbilisi was the most cosmopolitan in the Caucasus, a place where Georgian, Armenian, Persian, and Greek mingled freely, where scholars debated theology alongside astronomy, where the poet Shota Rustaveli composed The Knight in the Panther's Skin, Georgia's national epic, a work of such sophisticated moral and romantic philosophy that it was clearly produced in a civilization operating at full brilliance. Tamar was a devout Christian who was also a pragmatic ruler, appointing military commanders and administrators based on merit, protecting religious minorities within her realm, and engaging in diplomatic correspondence with the powers of Europe and the Middle East as an equal. She was canonized as a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church. Coins minted in her reign bore her image with the title King of Kings. She did not rule a mountain backwater. She ruled an empire that bent the world to its will. Every golden age carries within it the seeds of its undoing. Georgia's came not from within, but from a horizon no one could have imagined. In the 1220s, while the Georgian kingdom was still riding the last warm light of its golden era, a new force erupted from the east, one that would reshape the entire Eurasian world. The Mongols arrived in Georgia like a verdict from history. The armies of Genghis Khan and his successors did not merely defeat the Georgian military, they unmade the infrastructure of civilization. Cities that had taken centuries to build were burned in a single afternoon. The great monasteries, repositories of scholarship, art, and the sacred manuscripts that made Georgian culture unique were looted, their libraries scattered to the winds. The network of trade routes that had made Tbilisi a wealthy international city was severed, and the population of Georgia, which had perhaps reached a peak of 5 or 6 million souls during the Golden Age, collapsed under the combined weight of invasion, plague, and famine. And yet, Georgia was not extinguished. The Mongol storm passed, or more precisely, it transformed into occupation, then into a kind of rough coexistence, then gradually into recession. The Georgian kings became vassals, then negotiators, then survivors. They bent without breaking. They preserved what they could, the church, the language, the manuscripts in the mountain monasteries where no Mongol cavalry could easily ride. The mountain villages of Svaneti and Kazbegi became in this era not simply places of dramatic beauty, but places of refuge, cultural vaults sealed by altitude and terrain. But the Mongols were only the first catastrophe. The 14th century brought Timur, Tamerlane, the the Turco-Mongol warlord who made 7 separate devastating campaigns into Georgia between 1386 and 1403. 7 times he came, and 7 times the Georgian cities burned. Timur was systematic in a way the Mongols were not. He specifically targeted the symbols of Georgian Christian identity, destroying churches, massacring priests, attempting to sever a people from their God. He failed. The churches were rebuilt. The priests were replaced by more priests. The mountains remained.
Then came the Ottomans from the west and the Safavid Persians from the east, and for 2 centuries, Georgia became the most contested ground in the Middle East, a buffer state torn between 2 of the most powerful empires in the world. The Shah Abbas I of Persia launched particularly brutal campaigns in the early 1600s, depopulating entire regions of eastern Georgia, forcibly relocating hundreds of thousands of people to Iran, and attempting to replace the Georgian population with Kurdish and Turkic settlers. The eastern Georgian capital of Tbilisi changed hands dozens of times. Every generation grew up knowing that another army was only a season away. Exhausted by centuries of war, the kingdom of Kartli-Kakethi, the last major Georgian political entity, made a fateful decision at the end of the 18th century. In 1783, King Erekle II signed the Treaty of Georgievsk with the Russian Empire, placing his kingdom under Russian protection. He understood the risks. He hoped that a Christian great power, sharing his faith, if not his language, would be a kinder master than the Muslim empires that had ground his country down for so long. He was wrong about the kindness, but perhaps right about the survival. In 1800, Russia annexed Georgia outright, and the Georgian royal house, the Bagrationi dynasty, which had ruled Georgia in some form for over 1,000 years, was dissolved. Georgian nobles were absorbed into the Russian aristocracy. The Georgian Orthodox Church was stripped of its autocephalous independence and placed under the Russian Holy Synod. The Georgian language was suppressed in official life. A new colonial order descended, more efficient and more comprehensive than anything the Persians or Ottomans had managed. And yet, the mountains remained beyond full reach. The highland villages of Svaneti, Tusheti, Hevsureti, and Kazbegi maintained a degree of de facto autonomy that Russian administrators found both frustrating and ultimately impossible to completely eliminate. The Svans were famously resistant. There are stories of Russian officers refusing to enter certain valleys without significant military escorts. The Hevsurs, the warriors of the northeastern highlands, reportedly carried on wearing chainmail armor and fighting with swords and shields well into the 19th century, maintaining martial traditions so archaic they seemed transported directly from the Crusades. A British traveler in the 1880s, encountering Hevsur warriors in their mountain strongholds, wrote with barely concealed amazement that he appeared to have stumbled upon a medieval England preserved in living amber. This is the paradox at the heart of Georgia's mountain culture. Isolation, which appears to be a form of poverty or backwardness from the outside, is actually a form of radical preservation. While the lowlands were remade by successive empires, the highlands kept the oldest forms of Georgian song, dance, architecture, law, and spiritual practice alive in a kind of cultural deep freeze. The price of survival was altitude. In February 1921, the Red Army invaded the short-lived Democratic Republic of Georgia, the brave, chaotic 3-year experiment in Georgian independence that had bloomed in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and crushed it. Georgia became the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, a constituent part of the USSR, and it was then subjected to the full and merciless program of Soviet modernization. The Soviet project reached into the mountains with a particular ambition. Roads were blasted through gorges that had been passable only by foot or horseback for millennia. Collective farms were imposed on village communities whose agricultural traditions stretched back to the Bronze Age. Churches, those stones that had survived Timur and the Mongols and the Persians, were converted into warehouses, stables, cinemas, or simply dynamited as symbols of the old superstition. The Georgian language was permitted to survive, but the intellectual class that wrote in it was decimated by Stalin's purges, and Stalin himself, let it not be forgotten, was Georgian, born Ioseb Yugashvili in the small industrial town of Gori, a man who carried within him a monstrous intimacy with the country he helped destroy. The villages of the high mountains experienced Soviet modernity as a kind of slow erasure. The young were drawn, or forced, down to the new factories and collective farms of the lowlands. The old trades died with the old men. The ancient knowledge of beekeeping, of medicinal plants, of how to read the weather in the color of morning snow, of which prayers to say at which crossroads, this knowledge accumulated over 100 generations began to dissipate like morning mist. By the 1970s and 1980s, many mountain villages were half empty. The tower houses stood, but the families that had built them were gone. And yet, the mountains were not entirely tamed. In the deep forests and high pastures, practices persisted that the Soviet authorities found difficult to classify and therefore difficult to eliminate. The Georgian polyphonic singing tradition, one of the most complex and ancient choral systems in the world, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage, survived in the mountain villages because it lived in the bodies of people, in the memory of voices, in the call and response of men gathered around a table of wine and bread. You cannot dynamite a song. Georgia declared independence from the Soviet Union in April 1991, and the decades that followed were, to use the gentlest possible word, turbulent. Civil war, the loss of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in separatist conflicts backed by Moscow, economic collapse, the Rose Revolution of 2003, when citizens took to the streets with roses in their hands and swept a corrupt government from power with the gentleness of a prayer and the determination of something much older. The War of 2008, when Russian tanks rolled through the Roki Tunnel and Georgia bled again on its own soil. The slow, difficult, sometimes exhilarating process of building a modern democratic state on ground that has never, in 3,000 years, been allowed to simply rest.
And through all of this, the mountains endured. Today, the mountain villages of Georgia are undergoing a different kind of transformation. They are being discovered. Travelers from across the world, drawn by the dramatic landscapes, the extraordinary cuisine, the legendary Georgian hospitality, the deep wells of history that seem to surface in every stone and every face, are making their way up the winding roads to Ushguli, to Kazbek, to the remote valleys of Tusheti, accessible only in summer when the snowpack permits passage through mountain passes that close for 8 months of the year. The revival is real. Young Georgians, some returning from Tbilisi, some from abroad, are relearning the old crafts. There are guest houses now in Ushguli where the family serves you homemade churchkela, the traditional walnut and grape confection, dark and sweet, hanging in garlands from the ceiling like ancient jewelry, and where the grandmother sings at the table in a voice that has been singing the same melody, in the same language, in the same mountains for more than 1,000 years. The tension between two worlds remains. Georgia is a country with one eye on its ancient past and one eye on a European future. It has been an official EU candidate country. Its citizens have marched in extraordinary numbers for European integration, and yet it sits on the fault line between Russian influence and Western aspiration in ways that are not theoretical, but daily, dangerous, and deeply felt. To be Georgian is to live in this suspension, this constant negotiation between the world you came from and the world you are reaching toward. No journey through Georgia is complete without pausing, as Georgians themselves insist all journeys must pause at the table. Georgia is, by the most credible archaeological evidence, the birthplace of wine.
Not metaphorically, not approximately, literally the place where human beings first cultivated the grape and fermented its juice into something that changed the chemistry of civilization. The earliest evidence of winemaking in the world, residue found in clay vessels called qvevri, dates from approximately 6000 BC and was discovered in Georgian soil. The Georgians have been making wine for 8,000 years, and their method, fermenting the grape whole, skins and seeds and stems together in large terracotta qvevri buried in the earth, produces wines so different from their European counterparts that tasting them for the first time is genuinely like tasting something from another age. They are amber-colored, tannic, alive, ancient. They taste the way the mountains look. And around the wine, the Georgian feast, the supra, is one of the great cultural institutions of the world. A supra is not merely a meal, it is a ceremony, a philosophical act, a statement about what human beings owe each other. There is a tamada, a toastmaster, whose role is to guide the gathering through a series of toasts that move from the general to the intimate, to peace, to Georgia, to the ancestors, to the guests, to love, to memory, to the future. Each toast is met with the response, "Gaumarjos," may you be victorious, and the guests drink the ancient amber wine from vessels that have held the same toasts for 100 generations. To be welcomed to a Georgian supra as a stranger is to be made temporarily kin. The concept of the tamada, the role of the host who must ensure every guest feels seen, fed, and honored, encodes within it a value system that says the stranger at your door is a gift from God. This is not merely hospitality, it is theology in the form of bread and wine. Then there is the music. Georgian polyphonic singing, 3 independent vocal lines woven together in harmonies that Western music theory struggles to categorize, is among the most sophisticated oral musical traditions on earth. It is sung at feasts, at funerals, at harvests, at church. The songs of the mountains are different from the songs of the lowlands, harsher, more spare, more resonant with the sound of wind through stone corridors, but they share the same essential architecture, voices in conversation, each one independent and yet each one making the others more powerful by its presence. It is, in its way, a perfect metaphor for what Georgia is. We began our journey in the mountains, and we return to them now, because it is in the mountains that Georgia's most profound mystery lives. Climb, on the last day of summer, to the pass above Ushguli. Stand where the grass ends and the glacial rock begins, at an altitude where eagles hang motionless in the air below you, and the peaks of the greater Caucasus extend in every direction like a stone ocean frozen mid-storm. Look down at the village, the towers, the stone houses with their slate roofs, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from a chimney where someone is baking bread or warming wine. Think about all that this village has witnessed, the armies that passed through the valley below, Roman, Arab, Mongol, Ottoman, Persian, Russian, Soviet. The plagues and famines, the earthquakes that toppled towers and were repaired with the same stone, the same hands. The children born and grown old and laid in the churchyard outside the walls. And now, think about the families still living there. A woman hanging laundry between 2 towers that her ancestors built in the 12th century. A man checking on his cattle in the same pasture his family has used for 500 years. A child running down the same lane, between the same stones, toward the same river that every child in that village has run toward for a millennium.
These are the last mountain villages of Europe, not because they are dying, though some are, but because they represent something Europe has largely lost, a living, unbroken thread connecting the present to the very deep past. There are no reconstructions here, no historical reenactors, no theme parks. The past is simply still happening, in the hands and voices and daily practices of people who never quite let go of it. Georgia, the country between 2 worlds, has survived because it found a third world, the world of its own mountains, its own language, its own songs and wines and prayers.
It survived not by being powerful enough to defeat its enemies, but by being deep enough that its enemies could never fully reach the bottom of it. The mountains are not merely the backdrop to Georgian history. They are its protagonist, its fortress, its truest self. Every stone tower in Svaneti is a sentence in a story about what it means to refuse to be erased. Every qvevri of wine buried in Georgian earth is a time capsule of human ingenuity and persistence. Every three-part harmony rising from a mountain village at dusk is a conversation between the living and the dead that has been ongoing without interruption for longer than most nations have existed. Georgia does not ask you to admire it from a distance. It pulls you to the table, fills your cup with amber wine 8,000 years in the making, and asks you a question in a language unlike any other on earth. How long will you stay? Georgia is not a small country that happened to survive. It is the living proof that civilization is not measured in the size of the empire or the reach of the army, but in the depth of the roots. 3,000 years of invasion, occupation, and forced transformation could not uproot a people who had planted themselves, their alphabet, their faith, their songs, their wine into the mountains with the permanence of bedrock. The mountain villages of the Caucasus are not relics. They are not quaint survivals to be photographed and left behind. They are repositories of something the modern world is only beginning to understand it is losing. The knowledge of how to be a specific people in a specific place, how to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, how to face the future without surrendering what makes you irreplaceable. Georgia stands between two worlds, East and West, ancient and modern, empire and independence, and chooses every day to be neither one nor the other, but irreducibly itself. The towers of Svaneti will still be standing when many of the institutions we currently consider permanent have crumbled. The Georgian language will still be written in its extraordinary script when much of what we call progress has been forgotten. The mountains remember everything. They are still waiting for you to come and listen.